Yep.
All right, just quickly, everyone can see my screen, right?
Yes, of course.
Perfect. All right. So, hello everyone. First of all, a big thank you for taking out time on your weekend and joining us. I am hoping that this next 20-30 minutes will add value to your weekend, right? And let's deep dive into the content that we have for today, right? So, for folks who are wondering what is this consultant to architect is all about, so folks who have been in touch with me or following me on my social feeds, I have been a huge advocate for D2C, which was more of how developers can build a consulting mindset. So we did a whole campaign across India for D2C, and I'm extending that campaign now from how can a consultant become an architect, right, with an architect mindset. And as part of that series, I had presented this topic at the Salesforce Architect Summit in Pune this year. So and I think Rahul kind of requested that we should have the same session on this group as well, so that we can share this topic with them as well. So Rahul, thank you for introducing me. As you said, I'm working at a Big Four. My primary role is around Salesforce architecture, but I also lead the whole architect practice at one of the Big Fours. And as I've said, like I'm passionate about building mindsets, whether it is consulting mindset or architect mindset, based on where you are in your journey in the Salesforce career. This mindset would help you in elevating yourself. So with that, let's look at what is this org strategy all about, right? So will in any kind of content where I deliver, right, or any kind of presentation that we go with, we always want to know why are we doing this, what are we going to do, and how are we going to do this, right? So with that concept, let's see why, what, and how to define an org strategy for your Salesforce implementation. Uh, Unfortunately, we cannot do as an interactive session because of this virtual setup and the technology constraints. But if we were in a room, right, I would have liked to know how many of you would have really defined an org strategy for your clients, or how many of you have got a chance to think about this topic, because this is not something which is quite evident in our day-to-day roles, right? We don't really get a option to provide our inputs while defining an org strategy. Most often than not, in 90-95% of the when the project comes in, the client has already taken a call on whether they will go for a single org versus multi-org. Now, that's where, as an architect, right, it's important to understand what goes into that thought process. What are the parameters or the attributes that contribute to that conversation and discussion, and what are the ultimate parameters on which a decision is taken, right? And mostly we think, when we think about a single org versus multi-org, we think about cost angle to it, we think about regulation or compliance angle to it, right? But there's a bit more to that, to those attributes. So we are going to explore all of that today. So stay tuned. So first of all, why there is a need of an org strategy to be in place, right? Which are those scenarios which will trigger that thought that we need to have an org strategy? Okay. So first is whenever clients are moving from a legacy application to a cloud. Let's say the CXOs within the client firm decide to go on for a digital transformation journey, right? And digital transformation can be of anything, but it means that you're going on a journey to transform your systems or applications for your end users or for your internal users, so that they can have a better tools to operate on their day-to-day business and get better ROI on whatever they are delivering on, right? So those are transformational projects where client might decide to go from legacy applications to cloud-based applications. Another scenario which is highly evident is mergers and acquisitions. So businesses acquire other businesses, right? Salesforce also has gone through a series of acquisitions over the last few years, right? Uh, any company which goes for acquisitions, or there might be scenarios once you have acquired, you kind of merge into that parent company, right? Or there could be a scenario where a company has become so big where they want to take out a arm of their business and put it into a separate company itself, right? and we can all see these mergers and acquisitions happening all around us, right? So whenever a Salesforce is used as a CRM platform, the businesses might want to take a decision whether we want to do the CRM part of the business process on the same org, or they want to split, or they want to merge. If the acquired company already had a Salesforce CRM, whether they want to merge it into their own, or they want to keep it as separate, right? So all of these are interesting conversations, which will help us in the base is that org strategy needs to be defined. The last part is the regulations and compliances, right? And you cannot really have any kind of workarounds. Some of the governing laws that we have, some of the data regulations we might have, some of the compliances from a legal, from a industry standard standpoint, we cannot really go over it or do any kind of workaround. So we have to respect the land of the law, right? We have to respect governing policies. We have to respect, if there is a let's say in Europe we have GDPR, right? So we have to respect when we are implementing those laws for those particular regions or geographies, and every region across the world will have specific laws or compliances to be followed, right? So every Salesforce implementation kind of the architects need to have a good understanding of what those compliances are. When you're architecting a solution, or even when you're suggesting an org, whether it's a single or multi-org, you have to keep the data residency in mind. Where exactly the org will be set up by Salesforce, and how are you going to use that org? Who are the end users who are going to log in? What kind of data you are going to share with them, right? So all those aspects needs to be kept in mind. So with that, normally when you go from a legacy to cloud, you go for a merger and acquisition scenarios, you might end up in doing a greenfield implementation, and I'll explain what a greenfield is, right? Or a brownfield implementation. Greenfield is very simple in a very plain language, something which you're going to start from scratch. You take a plain vanilla org of Salesforce and you start building on top of it. Brownfield implementation is more evident when you're doing a uh, let's say merging of a new org into an existing org, right? Which means you are basically bringing in changes to an existing implementation, which is why it is called as brownfield. Which means you are trying to plow, if you consider in the farmer's context, you're trying to plow an existing field which is already been harvested, right? So that's where the greenfield versus brownfield concept has come up. And at the end of the day, whichever type of implementation it is, you have to define an org strategy, right? So I hope this kind of gives you context why we are discussing this topic, right? As I said, not all of us would get into those conversations, but as you grow in your careers, where you go into uh, an architect path, or even if you're in a management, right? When you're having those conversations in a leadership role with your clients or as a senior architect, you will tend to get into these conversations as well. So let's do a quick assessment when we start talking with our clients, right? So first and foremost question that comes to our mind when we talk about org strategy is, what is your business operating model? And we'll deep dive into the four operating models that typically a business would look at. Okay, so keep that question in mind. What's your business operating model? Then are there any regulatory or compliance requirements which might influence your decision making? Who is going to sponsor this transformation project, right? Because where the money is coming from will have a significant impact on how the decision shapes up, right? And it is more on the business side. How are your end users going to collaborate? So if you have a business which is scaled across multiple geographies, if you are deciding on a single org versus multiple org, how are your users going to collaborate with each other? Let's say if you decide to go for a multi-org setup, right? How are your users in America are going to have a collaboration? Let's say they are working on a global opportunity, right? How are they going to collaborate on that deal with the users from, let's say, Asia Pacific, right? So user collaboration and data sharing is an important attribute which needs to be considered when you're thinking about an org strategy. Are there any security implementations, right? So let's say there might be certain governing policies which says data cannot move out of, let's say, US, right? For example, then how are you going to take care that whenever you're doing integrations between multiple orgs, how are you going to ensure that the security of the data is intact and nobody else is able to take out data outside that instance? Are you facing any challenges in your current implementation? So if any merger or acquisition scenario or any of the existing implementation, are they facing any scenario because of which they are thinking of now splitting up their org, or they this particular question would relate more to brownfield implementation where they are thinking of going from a single org to multiple org, because in their current implementation they might be hitting certain governor limits. Let's say they have already exhausted the number of custom objects that can be built on that object, or they have already exhausted the number of apex code lines that can be written on a single org, right? So if you're reading into those kind of hard limits where you cannot extend it further for whatever reasons, right, and then you still want the business to be operating on that instance for next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the line, right? So in the best interest of the company as well as for your end users, you might take a decision that you want to split it out into two different orgs or three different orgs based on where the uh, again, this is not a single point of decision making. You have to factor in all of these points which are listed over here before taking that call. What are your reporting requirements? So if you have a single org, it's fairly simple that you will report based on the data which is on that single org, right? Now when it comes to reporting, you can report on the same org, or you want to take the data outside of the platform and do an offline reporting using some of the tools like Tableau, BI reporting, QLake, right? All of these reporting tools. When it comes to multi-org, the scenario becomes a bit complicated. How do you get the data aggregated at one place? How do you report data from multiple different data sources, right? So then most often than not, you either have a master org which will collate all data into one single org, or you will go for an offline reporting, off platform reporting using tools like Tableau or BI reporting, right? Whatever is the reporting tool in the client enterprise landscape is available. So the last part is, let me hide this. What's your enterprise landscape and integration strategy, right? So, and these are the technical lenses that we need to keep in mind as an architect, that what is going to be the landscape of your client, right? So currently if they have let's say X number of integrations, right, and CRM will be at the core of their business, right, integrating with an ERP or with a uh, with an MDM solution, right, or with a single sign-on setup, right? So there will be a bunch of integrations in any landscape that you currently work on. Now, when you look at a multi-org setup, these integrations and number of things to taken care at the enterprise layer becomes that more complex, right? And we'll take a look at specific examples when it comes to these enterprise landscape and integration strategies uh, in the later part of the session. All right. So I was talking about the business operating model. Let's take a quick look at what these operating models means, right? So from a business lens standpoint, there is an x-axis, there is a y-axis, right, as indicated in this diagram. Now, businesses typically think about maintaining standardization, right? Less of customization. Let's go for standard processes which will be used by each and everyone within their organization, no matter where the user sits. Okay, no matter how many business units that they have, right? So we are going to measure this on a low parameter and a high parameter, and then similarly, businesses would also want to see an perspective of if they want to go for more of an integrated approach, right, where the users are not isolated from each other but they are collaborating with each other, right, in a more integrated manner. The different, let's say if there is a client which is operating having a 10 different business units or 10 different business verticals, they want all these 10 businesses to be more integrated, working closely with each other for more cross collaboration, right, all those kind of aspects. Now let's look at each of these quadrants and try to understand what these operating model really mean, right? So when you look at a low and a low from a standardization standpoint and low from an integration standpoint, which means that client is really not looking for standard processes. They are more looking for every business can run their own processes. They don't want the users to much interact with each other. Like again, going back to my example of 10 different business units, right? Everyone is free to do whatever they want to, right? Independent business units with different customers and expertise. Like let's say each of these business unit is catering to a different type of their customers, right? And each of them are operating in a different geographies, right? So in those kind of setups, you can easily say that business operating model is a diversification, right? Where they are allowing them to work in their own ways, right, without much standardization and without much integrated approach. Now let's look at when the standardization is high and the integration is low. Here, you want the same processes to be followed by each of these users, but you don't want them to be integrated on a single org, right? So that's where replication concept comes in, where businesses are independent to do their own customizations, but they want at a central level some of the base processes around selling or customer service to be the same. So that's where you'll have one single org which will define the master processes, and then you'll have a replication model where you will deploy the same code base across multiple different orgs, and each of the business units who will be accessing Salesforce in their respective org will be able to do their customization, local level customization specific to their businesses in their respective orgs, right? So that is what the concept of replication is. And don't worry if you're not really following all of this, we'll have some visual diagrams which will allow you to absorb this in a quick way. There are some slides which are coming up, right, which will explain all of this in a very visual manner. Let's look at the left top, which is high integrated model and a low on the standardization, right? Which means there are business units which needs to know what is happening in each other's world, right? So let's say if there is an account or an opportunity where every business user would like to know what their opportunity is all about, right? And they want to cross collaborate. So in that case, it's more of a coordination effort, okay, where they need data sharing to be important, right? So you might go for a single org in this coordination effort. They might not stick to a standard business process. Every business unit might come up with their own custom requirements. Let's say 10 business units might come up with the 10 ways of different selling, right? But at the end of the day, they want to know what each other person is selling or each other business is selling, right? So for opportunity, let's say the sales stages, the sales process that we define, right? There could be 10 different sales process, one unique for each of those business units. But because they are on a single org, they will be able to share each other's data and they will be able to know which opportunities they are working on. So that's the concept of standardization and integration, right? And it's more of coordination, that is what they are expecting. Now, the top right corner is unification, where they want same processes to be followed. Every business unit, every business user to have the same kind of code base, same kind of logic to be built in, and they want everyone to access the same data, right? So that is where unification comes into play, where there is single org with the same process which been controlled centrally, and there is a central governing board, central build team who will build and deploy and design the same processes for them, right? So unification, coordination, diversification, and replication, these are the four operating models. Now my ask from all of you, right, if you really want to understand this, go back to your client engagements that you have and try to assess what is your operating model for your client, right? If you are working on any project, your client will fit into one of these, okay? And just try to do that exercise for yourself so that you can get to know why a specific decision was taken, why your client went for a single org versus multi org. And uh, in my experience, most of the clients which are of smaller size, right, from a business standpoint, they would always go for a single org because they don't have budget or an requirement to go for a multi org scenario, right? So keep that in mind as well. Let's look at it from a different lenses, right? I know there's a lot of text and I usually don't like a lot of text on my slides, but I will share this deck with Rahul, and we can probably find a way to share it with all of you, right?
Yes.
But the idea here is, right, when you talk to business, right, purely from a business lens point, every business will have a strategy on how to run their business, right? They want more innovation to happen, more changes to go to the production in a short span of time, right? That's what every business would look like. Speed of delivering to their users would be paramount for them, right? Versus their priority would not be that how do you maintain different processes, how do you do CI/CD, right? How do you ensure that there is standardization in the code base, there is standardization on the technology piece, right? So all of that is not their purview, right? And they would not really worry about too much about it. What their worry would be is how am I getting the best ROI from the code base or from the build that is happening? How am I going users going to use it, and how are they going to benefit out of it? Now, when you look at different business units and locations, they you'll have to decide whether they handle the complexity. How do they handle the complexity when a single org versus a multi org, right? So if you are having, let's say, 10 business units, how each business unit is going to get their change request into that org, and in what is the speed to market, right? So if, let's say, all 10 business unit, let's say, raise 5 different change requests, right? Within a month you'll have 50 change requests to be handled, and you have the same team who is supporting all of these business units, right? So you'll have to then do a prioritization. So often between multiple business unit there is a competing nature of which business unit gets a say in delivering their changes faster, right? uh, Again, it ties back to the operation model as well. What is your best approach to maintain standardization versus also maintain integrated way of working across multiple business units? So these are some of the areas which you'll have to work with the business and try to get a clarity on, because all of these things will act as an input to your decision making. How do you go for a single org versus multi org, right? When it comes to governance and culture, again, every IT project gets sponsored, right? All of us know that. Now, based on who is sponsoring it, which business unit is sponsoring what share of that budget, will get a higher say into what goes into the code base, right? And they might also influence the strategy of going with a single org versus multi org, because at the end of the day, they are funding the whole project, right? So based on the sponsorship, ownership, budget, who is doing it, which business unit is doing it, what is the stakeholder influence that they have on the decision making, all of those things will matter when you're deciding on something like this. The next topic is business and IT governance, where you'll have to maintain a balance, right? Business would always like to get things done faster. Now, IT will have to always ensure that when you're doing in a multi-org setup or in a single org setup, you're following the regression cycles, you're ensuring the end users are taken into uh, loop, right? Your super users are given access to your SIT cycles, UAT cycles, right? So when you're working in a multi-org setup or a multi-team setup, you'll have to balance out the business needs versus the IT governance factors that you have to consider. And the last part is appetite and readiness to change, right? So assess how quickly they want the changes to be there, and what is your company's maturity in accepting changes. Most of the IT projects, the biggest challenge which I have observed in my career is, no matter how good the implementation is or how best the quality you maintain in your implementation, it boils down, the success of the project or the program boils down to the user adoption and change management, right? So how effectively your business users are ready for that new wave or new application, new change that you're bringing them, right? So let's say if they are working, if they are used to working, let's say, on a legacy application in a particular way, right, where they maintain, let's say, all of their contacts in their Excel files or in their notebooks, right? Now we bring them a new brand Salesforce instance and ask them to key in data into the Salesforce org. No matter how well you have implemented it, they will be hesitant to load all of their contact information into Salesforce, because now the data is going into cloud, right? Now the data will be shared with other business units of theirs. So there is a change angle to every project that is getting implemented. User adoption is a big topic which we often ignore, but as a as a technical architect or as a tech team, we often ignore the concept of change management and user adoption. Keep that always in mind. So again, this particular attribute is key on how are you going to do bring governance to the entire program, and how are you going to make this as a success, right? And all of this becomes a key part of your decision making around org strategy. Now, obviously, once you're going to build something, right, on a single org versus multi org, how are you going to maintain it? So what is the operations angle to it? How are you going to design for a multi org setup versus a single org setup? How are you going to deliver a code base in a multi-org scenario versus a single org scenario? How are you going to do deployments? How are you going to support the end users, right? What is going to be a ticketing process? In a single org, it is fairly straightforward. You give them a case service request form where they can log in a service request or they can email to a support email ID and they can log their tickets, right? But how do you do that in a multi-org scenario? Do you have multi support team set up for each of those geographies or each of those business units? Probably no. You might want to do a single support team with a single CTI system. Everyone calls to that same helpline number and get their queries resolved, right? So different business models, different ways of operating will also play a big role in terms of how do you decide for a org strategy. I think I've covered all aspects of operations. Let's look at it from a tech lens standpoint, right? That is where our is like architects have a bigger role to play, right? Application architecture, how are you going to assess what is going to be the cost involved when you're looking at a multi-org setup versus a single org setup, right? All the app exchange apps that you will be using on a single org, now you'll have to replicate it for 10 different orgs, right? Whatever functionality you're building for a single org, now you'll have to replicate it for 10 different orgs, right? Data strategy, if you have an MDM into the client landscape, now that MDM system needs to be integrated with one org versus 10 different orgs, right? If you have a ERP system in the landscape, you'll have to integrate the same ERP process with 10 different orgs, right? So data strategy plays a very important thing when you're defining your org strategy, because your enterprise landscape will define the number of integrations that will be impacted, the number of testing cycles that will be coming into play, right? And you'll also have to factor in what are the Salesforce limitations when you're looking at a single org perspective. If your mindset is saying that no, we can achieve all of this from a single org standpoint, you'll have to factor in the volumes, the limitations of the number of uh, technical components you're going to build, right? Or the number of integrations that you're going to support on a single org. So you'll have to factor in those limitations as well. Now, you might ask, okay, how do I know all of this when things are not real, right? We are still discussing. That's where estimations, as an architect, your skill set comes to the forefront, where you are able to forecast some of these things based on the requirements, and then you can highlight some of these areas as well. Now, whatever I've spoken till now, right? How do I kind of simplify this for us to act upon? So this is a simple table which I would create for my clients. Okay, any client. Okay, not just with the current company, but all throughout my career. If I were into that shoes of defining an org strategy, I will say I will take a look at all of these areas, the four areas or the four lenses that I had spoken about: governance, business, technical, and operations. And each of these area talk about specific topic. Governance talks about collaboration, autonomy of doing business, business governance. Business talks about the level of shared data and shared processes, flexibility and agility to change, multiple business units. Technical talks about security requirements, Salesforce limits, and application architecture within an enterprise landscape. Operations talk about how are you going to train your end users, what are you going to do, how are you going to do training for your end users, and how are you going to deploy against single org versus multiple org, right? I'll have a column for single org versus multi-org based on my assessment, talking to the business stakeholders, talking to the IT stakeholders of the client, talking to the end users, and in certain points will allow me to do a good assessment of which part is high. What is my assessment saying? For collaboration, obviously single org is always going to be high, right? If that is something which business wants from a governance standpoint, everyone should be collaborating on the same set of processes, same set of data, then I will go for single org. But if they don't want, if they want autonomous behavior where every business unit can have their own set of changes, own set of data, then we will go for a multi-org. Now, you can fill up this puzzle, okay, and then the question would be, how do I decide finally, right? So either you can decide once you have come up with this whole chart, right, and you can see which ones is trending more high, more low, or more high on this multi-org. You can have this as a presentation back to a panel of from the client team, and then collectively you guys can take a call. Okay, and the one part which is missing here is the cost angle to it, because if you go for multi-org, there will be some cost associated with multiple org scenario, right? There, that should be somewhere listed under operations, because that's the cost angle to it. So I will prepare all of this and then present it back to the client, and then we can take a call which one And as an architect, right, you'll always have a recommendation that based on all of these data inputs that I've received and our assessment, we would recommend single org on the basis of these pointers, right? That's how you would present it back to your client stakeholders. Now, I'd said earlier that if you're not getting those four operating models, we'll take a look at some visual diagrams. So when you talk about diversification, this is a simple landscape which any client, any basic client would have, right? So let's say you have a Salesforce instance, which a bunch of clouds from the Salesforce world. You'll have an ESB or an ETL in the landscape. You'll have an ERP and an MDM, right? Very basic stuff. And you'll have an identity provider, which allows you to do a single sign-on onto your org, right? Now, in a diversification landscape, just take example of two business units, right? Each of the business unit will have a similar landscape to work upon. Okay, now you can see the complexity of the things to be maintained. Everywhere you'll have to maintain different set of integrations. You'll have to maintain two different code bases. You'll have to have two different teams to maintain it, support it in the long run, right? And your users would never know what the each other's business unit are doing in their respective orgs, right? Unless you build an integration between both these orgs and share data among each other. So this is diversification, and the exact opposite to this would be unification, where you'll have single org, where all the business units are operating from the same org with the same set of details around data and processes. Fairly easy to consume if you look at it from a visual standpoint. Let's look at it from a replication standpoint, where except for Salesforce, rest everything is same. You have the same ESB ETL tools, you'll have the same ERP in the background, same MDM in the background, but just your Salesforce implementation will be different. Okay, this is a multi-org scenario, and there are patterns in which a multi-org can be implemented. I'll come to that as well in a moment. Okay, but you understand how the replication model will work. You'll have a same code base which will go into two different orgs, and you might want to deploy that as a managed package or an unmanaged package, so that every org has a consistency in terms of what code base is being deployed across multiple orgs. But the rest of the systems in your enterprise landscape will remain the same. Coordination, again, two different orgs, but they have a data sharing established between them, so that they can understand what kind of opportunities or what kind of accounts or clients they are dealing with, right? Rest everything remains the same. uh, Again, from an ERP MDM standpoint, you might have a global versus local concept, where each of the business unit might have, let's say, France versus Australia, right? France might have their own local setup of MDM and ERP, and Australia might be the one which will be in a global setup, right? Again, these are just representations in order to explain these concepts, but the real world scenarios might be a bit different and more complicated than this. This is our multi-org patterns, where you might want to do a multi-org setup based on regions or based on different business unit or based on hierarchy, right? Depending upon how the business operates, you might want to set it up based on if the businesses are grouped into a geographical region, or they have clear business unit verticals that the client might have defined, or they want to do it centrally, develop everything into one global org. That global org might be used for global reporting, and then you have business unit specific child orgs linked to that. Okay, so that's the more hierarchical way of delivering things or setting up things. All right, so we are at the end of this session, and I think we are doing good on time. So let's look at the pros and cons, right? Single org obviously would mean there is high collaboration, unified processes, single code repository, better governance, simplified sharing and visibility, right? No overlapping user license cost, right? This is one aspect which is often missed, that you'll have to replicate licenses. If the same user needs access to 10 different orgs, you need to set them as 10 different users into all of those orgs. It's simplified integrations, obviously, because you're talking about the same org being integrated to all these other systems. On the constraint sides, you if you are having regulatory requirements by geography, then you might struggle in meeting all of those regulatory requirements. Business specific localization challenges. So if every business wants their own specific customization or logic to be built as per their own needs, then at a single org it will be difficult to build a high level of localization for every business unit, right? Obviously, there will be challenges in implementing some of those. Governor limits raise because everybody is using the same set of resources, same set of limits provided by Salesforce. So your chances of hitting those governor limits are high, or complexity will increase over time. Now, this is one thing which is very interesting, that most of the clients would go for single org, right? And larger customers also. Over a period of time, let's say 5 years, 10 years down the line, they might feel that the complexity that has been built into the org has been growing over time, and it's nobody's fault, right? They might have taken that decision, let's say in 2023 today, right? And 2033 is when they realize, okay, this has grown to such a big org now, that you might want to do a diversification of complexity, right? DevOps processes becomes complex over a period of time when you have multiple business units operating from a same org. You might need a local admin rights for each of the business units. Each business unit will say, I want a local admin. Now, you once you have multiple admins on a same org, there will be chaos, and there will be issues or challenges on how to provide governance, because you might want to do a very strict governance when it comes to a single org concept. Configuration complexity might also grow over time. It's not just the code base, but the number of flows, the number of processes, the number of approvals, right, also will grow as and how you build on a year-on-year basis. Let's look at the opposite scenario, a multi-org setup. Pros are obviously that every org will have their own governor limit, so it's easier managed. Time to market is faster because every business unit will have their own org, so they can take a call what kind of customization they want to build and how they quickly deliver it on their production. Lesser complexity, local admins can have their playground to play with. Regulatory and compliance requirements can be met, and release cycles are very simplified. On the constraint side of it, I think it's exactly what was pro for the single org now becomes a constraint for a multi-org scenario, right? There is no unification of business processes. For data, you'll have to build a lot of integrations, collaboration. They'll have a challenge, right? Integration complexity will grow over a period of time. There will be overlap users with the license cost associated. For global reporting, you'll either have to have a global org somewhere, or you have to take it off platform, put it into a data lake or a data warehouse, and then use Tableau or some of the reporting tools out there to do a global reporting. Complexity of the governance increases over time because there is no single owner. From a business standpoint, every business unit is the owner of their single orgs, right? So complexity of governance from a core central standpoint becomes very complicated on how to manage these multi orgs. All right, with that, these are some of the links which I've used in my research around this topic. I went through each and every link which is mentioned over here in detail before coming up with this content. Some of this content you might see, like the image that I've shown for the operating model, you might see in some of these blogs as well. And it was published by some college, so we have given credit to that college as well whenever we are using that picture. But I hope this kind of gives you some idea of the complexity levels. It's not an easy decision for any client to go with a single org versus multi org because of so many attributes which are associated to this. As a technical architect, we tend to think only the technical side of the things, right? But there is so much on the business, operations, governance side of the things which we tend to miss. Okay, we think that it is easier to develop a code and deploy a code if it is a single org, right? And that's where our inclination is always towards going to the single org setup. If you ask me any day, I would always prefer a single org, right? Because it is less complicated for me as a technical person to manage it. But business or operations or governance might have a different angle to it, so which is good to know what goes into that decision making. And if you ever get a chance to derive this for your client, use this framework. I think it's a proven framework used by everyone out there, and it's been well documented as well. So use it wherever you need. And I really hope when all of you get that opportunity to define an org strategy one day for your clients, because it's fun. I know it's a lot of conversation, lot of assessment, and it's not pure play doing hands-on coding or building something, but the other side of the world is also a bit of fun. So with that, thank you everyone. I will wrap up this and open it up for Q&A. We have some time left for Q&A. So
Yeah. So
open it up.
any question you can put on chat. We can go through the chats. I don't see any questions as of now, but yeah, if there are any questions, feel free to put in chat. So Rupesh, one question I have. So does a data play a key role? Like there might be, as you mentioned, governance, right? So how does the data play a key role here?
So when you say data, right, you'll have to look at it from an enterprise lens point, right? So Salesforce is just one of the database which is out there,
Correct.
right? You might have an ERP, you might have an MDM, you might have 10 other systems within a client landscape, which where the data might reside. Okay. If you're looking just as a CRM lens standpoint, then it becomes important where is your Salesforce org been set up, whether it is in Europe somewhere, whether it is in US, or whether it is, let's say, in Asia Pacific, and what are the land data residency laws that you have to comply with. Okay, so that becomes a key factor when you're deciding where you want to set up your Salesforce org. And remember one thing: at this point, there is no org, right? You're just
Yeah.
conceptualizing what is your client going to do in future,
Correct.
and you're going to recommend them. Okay, set it up in Europe because you want to be compliant with GDPR, right?
Mm.
For example. Now, but if you look at from an enterprise lens point, let's say if you go with a single org, right, then you look at, okay, what is your data architecture going to look like? Which system will act as an MDM system? Where the data will flow from which system to what system, right? Versus if you go with a multi-org setup, right? Now you'll have to think about what is my data sharing requirements are all about, right? Because your users are spread across multiple orgs. Which system will then act as an MDM system? Where is your reporting going to happen, right? So data obviously plays a key role from a technical lens standpoint.
Okay.
The business angle to it would be, what does the business want, right? Do they want more collaboration on data, or do they want, they're happy that it's only reporting that needs, where that's where they need the data to be shared, right?
Got it.
So you'll have to look at both the lenses, the business lens as well as the technical lens, before arriving anything around data.
I think we have another question on the same side. So how the size of org make the decision for a multi-org? How much data size do we think can be accommodated in single org? I think what Yogesh is trying to say is, can data size be a problem?
So yes and no, right? So your data storage, if anybody have gone into Salesforce environment, look at company profile information,
Correct.
there is a data storage section, right, and a file storage section. So file storage is typically high than the data storage. Data storage is a direct computation that you get from your number of licenses that you purchase from your Salesforce, okay, for your client. So let's say there is some formula out there, I don't recollect that, but it is a direct calculation of the number of licenses that you have in your org. So just making up an example over here, right? So let's say if you're getting a 100 license from Salesforce org, and let's say every license will have, let's say, 200 MB of data or 500 MB of data, then you'll have 500 into 100, which will be around 50 GB of data, or 5 GB of data, right? That will be available for you to consume. Now, what happens when you consume all of that data storage? There is an two option, right? You will not necessarily go for a multi-org just on basis of data storage, because for data handling data storage, there are two or three ways in which you can handle that. One is, either you can buy additional data storage from Salesforce, but that is very, very costly. For every 500 MB, or I think it was 500 MB, for every 500 MB of chunk of data space, there is an X amount. Okay, and it is, I think it's available on a public site as well. The Salesforce help documentation will have all of those details. So, uh, for any client to buy 500 MB of data space from Salesforce is going to be a costly affair. So, what do we do normally as a tech? What we recommend is, figure out what is your data which you can archive, right? What is that data that is no longer relevant for your business? Let's say anything which is a year old, you can take it off the platform. If you need it for reporting, then you can put it into a reporting tool and report on it. But if you don't need that data for any of your active transactions, then take it off the platform. If you have a smaller org size, but if you have a larger org size, then you don't need not worry. But data archival is an important concept in architecture, where based on your data storage, incremental storage that happens year on year basis, right? you might want to put in certain archival policies in place for data governance, so that you don't hit those data storage limits, right? So either you can purchase additional data storage, or you can go in for an archival. Archival is a better solution than going for an expensive purchase of a data storage. But let's say if you are in production, and if you have not monitored it, right, and you've already consumed it, your business is like on a standstill, there will be some time required for taking the data off the platform, right? So you might, in those emergency kind of situation, you might go to Salesforce and say, okay, can you give me 500 MB of data, or can you give me a trial period or an extension period of X days, so that I can do this archival and then get back into the green zone. So I hope, Yogesh, that kind of answers your question. But I would not necessarily go for a decision around multi-org just on the size of the org.
Yep, that makes sense even. I think, yeah, okay. I think the question answers. Any other question team we have for here? Okay, in interest of time, Rupesh, thank you very much for bringing this up again, and giving this a broader view of how we decide the org strategy, at least providing a thoughtful insight. uh, I would at some point of time in my career, I would love to do this. But yeah, thank you for all the great insights that you provided today. It was fun to hear.
No, thank you everyone. Right, I really appreciate that folks are taking out time on a weekend and dialing into these sessions. I'm doing this virtual session after a long time, so glad to be here. Always enjoy talking to people. Yeah, just downside is that we cannot hear you guys,
Yeah,
but I would have loved to do this in person someday.
yeah,
Let's plan for that. And if we happen to meet in any of the conferences in India, would like to meet you guys and say hello.
yeah.
All right. Once again, thank you. Happy weekend. Enjoy your time over the weekend and take care, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rupesh, for your session, and thanks for your time as well. It was a great session.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.